So before I came here, I had heard about the famous Basque hospitality, which I have already experienced. Yesterday evening, Cabinet Chief Barandiaran and some other leaders hosted a small informal gathering at a wonderful place over by the Comb of the Wind. And we watched the sun go down for all of the international speakers. We watched the sun go down. We had marvelous pinchos and cider and wine, and Cabinet Chief Barandiaran gave some very gracious remarks, welcoming the international visitors, saying he hoped that Gipuzkoa could learn from us, but also that we could learn from Gipuzkoa. And I would like to tell you I have already learned 3 important lessons from Gipuzkoa. I will tell you how I learned these lessons. After the gathering, I was walking back to the hotel along the beautiful path by the sea, and there were lots of happy people on the path after the boat races. And about halfway between the Comb of the Wind and my hotel, 2 large groups of friends encountered each other on the path. I think they must have been from the same village here for the boat race. And they stopped and they chatted and they blocked the path completely. And nobody was upset about that. All the other Basque people on the path with me just simply went along to the side and didn't bother the people there. And I followed them along to the side. And I was thinking about what I'd heard earlier in the evening and what I was going to tell you today. And suddenly, I found myself lying on the ground, like Paul on the road to Damascus. And here are the 3 things that Gipuzkoa had taught me. The first thing, there was a tree branch off to the side of the path. The second thing, I am a little bit taller than most Basque people. And the third thing I learned is that I am perhaps not as smart as Cabinet Chief Barandiaran believes I am. But I will nonetheless try to, in exchange for the lessons Gipuzkoa has taught me, I will try to offer some lessons as well. I'm going to talk a bit about some definitions, different kinds of governance, and invite you to understand that a good way to think about different kinds of public and private interaction is in terms of who is in control, who has discretion within the relationship. And I will try to define what I call collaborative governance and distinguish it from other forms of public-private interaction. I will talk about some of the advantages and some of the risks of this approach to governance. I will give a few very brief examples, and I will talk about the analytical and the management imperatives that are involved in doing this well. And I will offer a few very brief observations on the specific case of the Basque Country. Most of what I have to say is drawn from a book called Collaborative Governance that I did with a co-author a few years ago. A little bit is drawn from a book I did myself about the peculiarities of public sector labor markets in the advanced world. And a tiny little bit is drawn from a wonderful book that Javier Font recommended to me, The Basque History of the World. So I guess one question, why here now in 2017 are we talking so much about public-private collaboration? What is different about this moment in history from 20 years ago or 50 years ago? One thing that has changed is as society becomes more complex, public tasks are moving towards things that either invite or sometimes absolutely require the engagement of the private sector. There also is a relative erosion in the capacity of the state. Governments in much of the rich world are declining in capability relative to the private sector in financial terms, but especially in terms of highly skilled personnel, which are the most important resources for accomplishing almost any mission. There are also new institutional and technological tools, new forms of measuring and monitoring, new kinds of legal institutions that permit more complicated kinds of relationships than would have been feasible in the past. We often think of the model of public service in the mid-20th century, when I was born, and the later 20th century when I grew up. The basic model involved central state dominance. You know, the nation state was the most important actor. Direct governmental action. Governments did things themselves. They hired people, they built organizations to do the work. And government administration was quite elite. The smartest people in most societies were doing the work of central government. This is changing. Public service is moving away from that 20th century model. And it's changing in two directions, okay. Both up and down, up to levels of governance above the nation state, such as the EU, down to levels of governance below the nation state, subsidiarity, such as the Basque Country and the individual provinces. And this is something that's occurring through most of the world. But beyond that movement up and down, which I won't really discuss today, there's been movement out from the state itself and to private organizations, which are somewhat simplistically described as for-profit or not-for-profit. Okay. So we now have, instead of all the action being in the middle, in the nation state, we have tasks associated with governance, tasks that are important to the welfare of the community as a whole, that are carried out in part by a whole different array of organizations. Now, one of the important things that's driving this, and one area of my abiding interest in research, is discrepancies in compensation between the public and private sector. I wrote a book in 2008, I believe, and this chart actually is about 80% of the content of that book, which is a little embarrassing, because if I can tell 80% in one chart, one wonders why I wrote a whole book about it. But the basic notion is that in the public sector, compensation is relatively flat. The low end earns, low end in terms of skill, talent, training, whatever you want to think about, earns less than the high end, but not a great deal less. That is a characteristic of government, and it always has been a characteristic of government. Okay. And back in, the 1970s, 1980s, when I was growing up, the private sector offered higher pay at the high end and lower pay at the low end. That is nothing new. That is perennial. What is new is that in the past 30 years or so, in all of the rich countries, there has been an explosion of inequality in the private sector. And at the high end, the ceiling has blown off. At the low end, the bottom has fallen out. And so what used to be small gaps in compensation at the high end and the low end between government and the private sector have now become enormous gaps. And this has quite serious consequences for government's ability to operate. The gap at the top, which is the more obvious problem, means that government doesn't get its share of top talent, and it's not as smart as it needs to be. Less obviously, but no less importantly, the gap at the bottom, the fact that less skilled people, and by less skilled I basically mean anybody with less than a university degree, less skilled people do much better in government than they would in the private sector. That gap makes government less flexible than it needs to be, because there are lots and lots of people who recognize they have a great deal to lose if they lose their government jobs, or if their government jobs become like business jobs. And so they are very defensive and resist change, and I would too. But that syndrome means the government becomes less flexible. Okay. So if the mid-20th century model featured central state dominance, direct government action, and an elite public service, we're moving towards a new model where you have the erosion of the central nation-state preeminence, This place right here is a dramatic example of that, where the nation state of Spain is considerably less important than it was 30 or 40 years ago, and the higher level of the EU and the lower level of the provinces and the Basque country are more important. A broad shift from direct to indirect governmental action, greater roles for private agents, and all of this amid chronic talent shortages in the public sector. When I say an enlarged role for private agents, by the way, I want to be very clear. This is not compared to the way things have always been, but rather compared to the 20th century model. And in some ways, the 20th century model is more the exception than the rule. If you look at the broad sweep of the history of government, there's actually a book by J.S. Feiner, 3-volume book by Oxford University Press called The History of Government. I might be the only person other than Mrs. Feiner who's read the whole thing. It's possibly one of my colleagues here as well, because it's a very big book. But it actually shows that through most of the history of government, public activity has been more indirect, more involving the private sector than involving the conventional state. So this change is only relative to the mid-20th century. In some ways, a return to the historical norm. If you think of Roman tax administration, that was entirely contracted out. The basic model is that the Romans would put out a bid and say, how much are you willing to pay for the right to collect taxes from a particular region? And then you can collect all the taxes you're able to squeeze from the peasants. So this contractual model of Roman tax administration is why tax collectors figure so badly in the Bible. They were kind of rough on the peasants. Another dramatic example is mercenaries. We in the modern world tend to think of mercenaries as an aberration. You know, soldiers are citizens. Soldiers are not for hire. But in fact, for much of our history, I'm told by military historians, up until Venice in the early Middle Ages, citizen armies were unusual. And if a leader wanted to wage war, he would hire mercenaries. Now, when I speak about this normally, I would say he would hire mercenaries, and if he could afford them, he would hire the Swiss. But in reading a little bit about the Basque country, I have learned that, in fact, way before the Swiss were the world's best mercenaries, the Basques were considered the world's best mercenaries. And the famous Basque army that fought for Hannibal against the Romans, even more formidable than the Swiss. So from now on, when I speak about mercenaries, my example will be the Basques rather than the Swiss. Also, trade companies. There was a time that the completely public mission of exploration and spreading influence around the world was carried out not by governmental organizations, but by private organizations, such as the famous British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. These were private, profit-seeking, very much profit-seeking organizations, but they were in some ways arms of the British and Dutch state. And again, I've used these examples in the past. I will now more often use the example of the Royal Guipuzcoa Company of Caracas, which was similar to the British and Dutch East India Company. It was set up to, in part, to make money, and it actually had, but it had some public features. Public features included the fact it was chartered by the Spanish king. It explicitly and effectively served foreign policy goals of the Spanish government. It served economic development goals of the Basque region. That was part of its mission. And it had and used military capabilities. So it had definitely some public features. It had some private features as well. It was founded by wealthy Basques, not by any government. Its main goal was for these wealthy Basques to get wealthier, even though it served other public goals on the way to it. It was answerable to owners and not to citizens, and that's a very important distinction. Even though the wealthy people who started the company felt themselves very much to be Basques and cared about the Basque region as a whole, the company's goal was to do well for the owners and only secondarily to achieve any other purposes. And it was free to shift missions as its original mission became less desirable and new opportunities arose. And in fact, it eventually became the Gipuzkoa Company for the Philippines. So, hold that aside for a moment. One broad question that arises in this, this issue of why do we talk about public-private collaboration now, if there are, in fact, increasingly public tasks that require the special capabilities of private organizations, well, an obvious response to that is just change government. Just change government so that it behaves more like private organizations. If you need private capabilities, import them into government. And when I was working in the Clinton administration, I was actually involved in a massive, quite serious, and to some extent successful effort to change government to make it more like business. And this has been a very fashionable theme in scholarship and also practice for a very long time. But here's the, and let me underscore, if it's easy to change government, to make government like business, there's no reason for collaboration. Government doesn't need the private sector. Government can do everything itself. Here's why I think there is a limit to that approach. Here's why I think collaboration is necessary. And that's that there are serious limits to how much you can do in making government more like business. Here's how I think about this. I think it's not that business is more accountable than government, or government is more accountable than business. It's that the two kinds of organization have different forms of accountability. And I think of these as extensive accountability versus intensive accountability. Extensive accountability is characteristic of public organizations. That is accountability on a large number of dimensions to a large number of people. At the extreme, think about the Secretary General of the United Nations, who in some ways is accountable to everybody on the planet, except the North Koreans and a few others, on just about any dimension you might care to think of. At the other extreme, imagine you have a chef in one of the restaurants in town, and he gets tired of cooking every night, so he turns the restaurant over to a hired manager and goes to retire in the countryside. Well, think about the hired manager. Her responsibility is, at the extreme, one dimension, how much money is sent, to one person, the retired chef. Okay? So that's very intensive accountability. So I would say that extensive accountability is what defines a public organization, and intensive accountability is what defines a private organization. And here is the point. You can't maximize both. You can't make an organization maximally accountable on both dimensions. At least, I have never seen it happen. It's possible that in the Basque country, you're much better at that. I mean that serious. It's quite possible that the Basque country, the Basque people have found ways to combine intensive and extensive accountability. But I have never seen it before. And so if you have a piece of work that requires intensive accountability, it's often a good idea to find a way to get private organizations to do that piece of work. Conversely, if a task properly involves extensive accountability, it's very hard to remove government from the picture. Broadly accountable, electorally accountable government. And because the different kinds of organizations have different strengths and weaknesses, collaboration between them is very often important. They cannot replace each other. So extensive accountability, an example was Jose Antonio Aguirre, the short-lived president of the Basque country back in the 1920s, said that as president of my country, I swear to serve my term faithfully. There can be no better statement of extensive accountability. He is declaring his accountability very broadly and to all Basques. Conversely, think back again of the Royal Company, Guipuzcoan Company of Caracas, private organization, accountable more broadly than some private organizations, but ultimately responsible to its owners for their wealth. And at one point, the Royal Guipuzcoa Company of Caracas tried to enter the slave trade, even though the slave trade was repugnant to Basque values. Okay? It looked like it was going to be profitable, so they felt they were obliged to try to enter it. I think to the relief of everybody, they failed in the slave trade. But the fact that they considered it, I think, is an illustration of the intensive accountability of private organizations. So, this distinctive feature of intensive accountability means that private organizations are often much better able to control costs, much more flexible, they're much hungrier to find new ways to do things, and these are advantageous for some private tasks. Involving private players in public service can sometimes bring resources, can bring increases in productivity, can bring in information relevant to the accomplishment of some public task, and often can bring in legitimacy as well. This is sometimes a feature in the United States where we tend not to like, we like to have as little government as possible, and so sometimes involving the private sector, even if there are no other advantages, can bring legitimacy. So actually one example that I discovered in my research was in the United States, when we set up the first stage of our public health insurance system, Medicare, providing health for the retired and elderly, it was very controversial. Great deal of political resistance to the radical notion of providing health care for elderly people. And President Lyndon Johnson brought in his political advisors and said, how can I make it more likely that this will pass the Senate? And his advisors said, make sure that there is a maximum role for business. Even if it doesn't make sense, bring in business. And so one important function was designating and monitoring the hospitals to allow them to take Medicare patients, to treat elderly people and charge the government. And there was an organization that was already in the business of certifying hospitals for private insurance. And some of Lyndon Johnson's advisors said, well, we could put this organization in charge of certifying hospitals for government insurance. And Johnson said, do they do a good job? And they said, not particularly. They're okay. We would do a better job in the government, but if we say this is a private function for government, it will create more legitimacy. And so that private organization was in the legislation given responsibility for certifying hospitals. Interestingly, the organization didn't even know that it was being assigned in the legislation that task, called the Joint Commission on Healthcare Organizations. So it was a happy surprise for them that they were then in charge of the flow of money for government insurance. The United States is a little bit unusual in the high legitimacy it accords the private sector relative to government, but it's not the only place where bringing in private organizations can improve the legitimacy of public tasks. And yet there are also risks involved in involving the private sector. One is that government tends to lose control over the cost of public services or the performance of public services. Another is that the public agenda can be distorted. If private organizations are involved in carrying out government's work, they might have both the incentive and the opportunity to influence what is defined to be public work. This is actually something that in the United States people are very concerned about with private organizations running prisons. If private organizations are in the business of incarcerating people, might they not be motivated to use their political influence to, increase prison sentences? It turns out, yes, there actually is some evidence that they do that. That's probably the most dramatic example of distorted public agenda, but there are many others. Another is, citizens don't care if government is doing its work through private organizations. They care, is the work being done well? And if a private agent does the work badly, people don't blame the private sector, they blame the government. And this can be one of the most important risks of involving the private sector in public work, is this reputational entanglement. And finally, something that people do sometimes worry about is if government ceases to do something itself, it may lose the capacity to do that work in the future. And sometimes this is a big problem, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's if government gets out of the business of doing something, it's extremely difficult to get back in the business. Other times, it's quite easy. I actually think this is something that people worry about a little bit more than they should. Okay, I promised I would talk about the allocation of discretion. There are many different kinds of private involvement in public work. Okay, and if government itself is in control, if government keeps to itself discretion in the relationship, we would call this outsourcing or other kinds of contractual relationships, where government says what is to be done, the private sector just does what it's told. So this would be the governmental extreme of discretion. At the other extreme of discretion, where the private sector has all of the control, we think of philanthropy, or voluntarism, or corporate social responsibility. And what I define as collaborative governance is the middle ground. The middle ground where discretion is importantly shared, okay, where both the public and the private players in the relationship have an important degree of control. Neither is the master, neither is the servant. It's a complex relationship of shared discretion. And of course, these borders are not bright lines, that one form shades into the other. But I do think it's important to recognize the different kinds of public-private interaction. And I actually tend not to use I tend not to use the term public-private partnership because it sometimes refers to all three. When I was starting this book, Collaborative Governance, about 10 years ago, I asked it was going to be called Public-Private Partnerships or something about that. And I asked my research assistant to gather the most popular, the most read books and articles on public-private partnerships. And I closed up my office door with a huge pile of things to read. And the first thing I read about public-private partnerships was about a contract to pick up solid waste. And the second thing I read about public-private partnerships was about a compact to end global poverty. And I thought, if the same term applies to both of those things, it's not a particularly useful term. And so we invented this term collaborative governance, not because it's particularly meaningful, but because it wasn't widely used and we could define it as we wanted. And we define it as an arrangement in which discretion is widely shared. I don't insist, by the way, that my colleagues don't use the term public-private partnerships. This is local option. But for me, it is awfully broad. Okay, so some characteristic US examples to give you a sense of what I mean by collaborative governance. One of my very favorite examples is Millennium Park in Chicago. If any of you have been to the city of Chicago in the past decade or so, you would have seen this park. And it was a small example, not very important, but a beautiful illustration of shared discretion, where the government of the city of Chicago built an underground parking garage right in the middle of the city. And somebody said, well, why don't we put a little park on top of it? And somebody else said, wouldn't it be nice if it was a very beautiful park with sculptures and other attractions? And the mayor said, but we don't have the money to do that. We just have the money for some grass and maybe a few benches. And the mayor, who was a clever man, and his staff, who were smart people, realized that if they allowed companies and rich families in Chicago some freedom to make their own choices, that they could involve them in building a magnificent park. And so the Pritzker family and other wealthy families and companies put up a great deal of money and put in some of the world's best sculpture, including, by the way, a Frank Gehry concert hall that rhymes a little bit with the building in the Guggenheim in Bilbao. And it is one of those rare things that almost everybody is happy with. Now, the government didn't turn over control, didn't say the private sector can do anything it wants, and they actually turned down some proposals that were considered ugly or considered too much aggrandizing the patrons. The government didn't give away all discretion, but it shared discretion. In exchange for that sharing, it got many advantages from the private sector. Another example is the charter school movement. One of the things that Americans get most twisted up in politically is education. I know that here you're much more relaxed about different forms of educational control, but we tend to get into big fights over whether it should be government or the private sector to run schools. And one very happy compromise in recent decades are something called charter schools, where private organizations run the schools with public resources and answerable to the public sector. So the private organization is not fully in control, the government is not fully in control, discretion is shared. And sometimes this works very well. Often it works very well. Sometimes it works rather badly, on which more later. And another characteristic example is after the terrible events of September 11th, 2001, the United States suddenly realized it needed to increase its defenses throughout the country. And one particular area of concern were ports, where a maritime port was suddenly recognized as incredibly vulnerable. All kinds of things that bad guys could do to cause damage in or through a port. And so the Coast Guard, I believe there's a Coast Guard in Spain as well, sort of a naval force responsible for domestic protection. The Coast Guard was given the job of figure out ways to secure the ports. And you can imagine, for example, requiring all ships to anchor 10 miles from shore until they were thoroughly searched. You can imagine ways to secure a port that would be very inefficient. You could also imagine a long list of government standards for safety measures that every facility, every factory, every shipper, everybody associated with the port would have to do exactly what the government said, and that could be inefficient as well. And there was actually a remarkable commander named Suzanne Engelbert, who was put in charge of this. She actually raised her hand and said, I think I can figure this out. And she held a long series of meetings with hundreds of people from companies and cities and all the stakeholders involved in the ports. And she came up with a plan that would be, nobody has to do anything in particular. There's no single mandate involved in port security. But everybody has to convince the local Coast Guard official that they have taken steps to lower the risk of terrorism. So very flexible, a lot of shared discretion. You're not allowed to maintain a situation that's dangerous, but you're allowed to find your own way, your own most efficient way of lowering risks. So these are three examples of true collaboration where discretion is shared. And the reason I mention these is that each of these functions you could imagine being done differently. So involving the private sector does not necessarily mean collaborative governance. If you think about, Millennium Park is a collaborative way of delivering a park, but you can imagine having the private sector involved in terms that the government kept all the discretion and just let contracts for doing this or that function. And you can imagine parks where the private sector has all the discretion. In fact, near the city where I went to high school, Indianapolis, one of the best parks in town was actually the corporate campus of a company called Eli Lilly, and it had nothing to do with government. It just was a beautiful green area that the corporation kept on its own. Likewise with schools, there's the collaborative approach of charter schools, but you can imagine, and in fact you can see, areas where the private sector is involved in schools that have nothing to do with private discretion. They're just doing government's bidding. And you can imagine and even see schools where the private sector is fully in control. And likewise with port security. Just because there's private involvement doesn't mean it's collaborative. So collaborative governance is not new, goes way back, it's not rare. I think it's underanalyzed relative to its importance. I think that its distinction from other forms of public-private interaction is too seldom recognized. I think it has broad potential to do good things, but it can also go wrong. There are multiple ways in which collaborative governance can fail, and it's often mismanaged. Okay, here is the generic challenge of collaboration. Here is the broad description of what's involved in getting collaboration right. Okay, you design the delivery model, and you select and motivate collaborators, so you maximize the gains and you minimize the losses of private discretion. And there almost always are losses involved in private discretion. Almost always are things where the private player will do things that wouldn't be government's first choice. So it's not avoiding any losses from private discretion, but making sure that the balance is favorable, so that the net benefits of the relationship are better than what you could get from alternative models. And these alternative models include government doing things itself, but it also includes other forms of public-private interaction, such as simple contracting, where government does not share discretion. And I won't go into all this, but these are some of the examples in our book. The point is, sometimes collaboration works out wonderfully. This right here is actually one of the sculptures in Millennium Park, which is one of the very best examples of public-private collaboration. You know, if it's the right model, if it's carefully analyzed, if it's skillfully managed, it can work out extremely well. And conversely, if it's not the right model, if it's not well analyzed, if it's not well managed, it can work out very badly. It's actually the United States, until recently, and probably again soon, delegated the task of managing lending for college students to private banks on terms of shared discretion. And it worked out extremely badly. The banks found ways to make profits that were far more than fair and provided bad service to the students. This was an example of collaborative governance, shared discretion that worked out badly. And the whole range can be seen. Sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't go well. And it's not just luck. You know, if it goes well, it's because the model was chosen appropriately, it was analyzed carefully, it was managed with skill. So these managerial imperatives of collaborative governance, and this is something worth stressing, they are fundamentally analytical. We often tend to think of, those of us who train people in government, we tend to think of policy design, policy choice is very analytical. And management is more straightforward. There's the distinction between policy analysis and public management. If your model is collaboration, those two converge. Okay. The management of collaborations is complex and demanding, and it requires high-level talent for implementation, not just for policy design. And this is something different. So in some ways, it's the convergence of policy analysis and public management. Okay. Now, here's the challenge to which collaborative governance can speak. There's an imbalance, I actually alluded to this earlier, there's an imbalance in most of the rich countries, especially in the English-speaking countries, but I think in most of the rich countries, between the public sector and the private sector. Some of this is new, some of this is built in. Most public sector institutions are anchored to a particular population, particular locale. Governments can't choose their citizens. They can't choose their region. They're rooted. Okay? They confront constraints on innovation, and this is for a good reason. People count on government for services, for rules, for law, and there are often concerns about government changing too quickly. Sometimes this goes overboard. Sometimes government is slow when it doesn't have to be slow. But there are legitimate reasons for government to be careful about innovation. And this is something that is relatively new. Most public organizations face challenges in getting and keeping the very best human resources. So government is chronically short on top talent. Okay? At the same time, most private sector institutions are very flexible on their mission, their constituency, their locale. Remember the Royal Guipuzcoa Company of Caracas. When it decided that Caracas, Venezuela, wasn't where the action was anymore, it could instantly become the Guipuzcoa Corporation for the Philippines. No problem. Government organizations can't do that. And likewise, even a private organization as unusual and broadly accountable as Mondragon doesn't have to stay in the same industry. If they decide that a founding industry doesn't work out quite as well as it used to, they will move slower than a conventional corporation, but they can still move in ways that a government usually does not. Private organizations are empowered to innovate. They have more right to change than public organizations do, and they're usually required to innovate. Unless they're completely free from competition, they will be obliged to change. And again, increasingly important, private sector organizations are a favored employer for top talent. Dean Van Slyke and I were actually lamenting yesterday how many of our best students go into the private sector when the public sector needs them, and that's what we're training them for. But the private sector is so much more attractive as an employer that many people who should be in government go in the private sector. So how do we resolve this imbalance between the capability of the public sector and the private sector? Well, one way is to strengthen government, or less attractively, weaken business to fix the imbalance. I am not holding my breath for this to occur. I think we're going to be dealing with this public-private imbalance for a very long time. Another possibility is to count on socially responsible businesses to fill government's role. This is incredibly popular in a lot of circles. I do a lot of work with Harvard Business School, and I would say this would be the normal attitude among both the professors and the students at Harvard Business School. We don't need government. We can count on socially responsible business, we can count on social enterprise to do all of the things the government used to do. I think this is a fashionable attitude. I think this is a profoundly misguided attitude. But it is an option. I think the third approach is to collaborate, set up arrangements for collaboration between the public and private sectors. So yielding discretion, accepting some of the losses of yielding discretion, but preserving that vital link to democratic accountability. Getting the benefits of private involvement, but without surrendering all the benefits of government. So collaborative governance, it's not new, it's not rare, it's also not ideal. It's not my first choice, maybe. My first choice would probably be having very effective, very accountable public organizations and have business do what business is good at. But that's not an option today. So this is often our best feasible option for creating public value in what I think will be a long era of public-private imbalance. A special case of the Basque Country, and these are very tentative observations. I have spent now about 2.5 days in the Basque Country. I've read one book. I've looked through Wikipedia, I've had some conversations with Javier Font, so I am the farthest thing of a Basque expert. Although I actually realized, I learned that Ignatius Loyola was a Basque. And since I had many years of Jesuit education, I guess I was made a little bit Basque without knowing it. But here are some tentative observations. The special features I perceive in the Basque country are almost all advantages, almost all ways that allow Basques to do better than other people in collaborative governance. And these include a small population, everybody seems to know everybody, the importance of reputation, makes good behavior accountability much more likely than in complex, heterogeneous, anonymous societies. That's a plus. I think the sense of shared identity and tradition is a huge plus as well. The fact that the businesses see themselves not just as capitalists, but also as Basques, very important. I think the distinctive culture that is probably, most famously exemplified in Mondragon, but shows up in many corporations, is an advantage. So in general, I think the Basque country has many, many opportunities to get the benefits and avoid the risks of public-private collaboration. And yet, effective collaboration does require public sector strength. I think it's important to remember that collaborative governance doesn't mean government is less important. It means government's role is important in different ways. And there are some complexities. The Basque governance is very layered. You have the localities, the provinces, the autonomous community, the nation of Spain, and EU. And there are lots of advantages to this. This can be a huge plus, but it also means the public sector is complex, and complexity can involve risk. So that's one feature to keep in mind. I've heard also that the civil service in the Basque country, while still very strong, is perhaps not as uniformly strong as it once was, and not as uniformly strong as it needs to be. If this is true, that's a concern, because effective collaboration does require very good civil service to manage it. I think you have the complex parliamentary coalitions that we see here. Again, a layer of complexity that can make collaboration a little bit riskier. So there is a potential, even in the Basque country, for underestimating the risks of private discretion. Now, like any academic, I did feel obliged to point out the risks and the negative sides. I will say, on balance, I think collaborative governance and the Basque country are a very good match. I suspect that I will be, when I talk to other groups, saying, you should only wish you were as lucky as the Basques. You should only wish that your culture was so well set up for public-private collaboration. And yet, collaboration is a tricky business. It's easy to make mistakes. So, just because you are on the right path doesn't mean that there's no tree branch hanging over it. So, be careful. Thank you.